Okay, now that we have an idea of who Patanjali might be, we're going to sort of go into the different sections of the Yoga Sutras. What are the sutras? And there's different sections of it. So we want to go a little bit deeper in each one and what can it offer us. So the first one, so first I'm going to just sort of talk about the Yoga Sutras. And so we start here. Right? And the term sutra, right, it comes from the same root as, so the root word as suture or thread, right? Weaving through or, right, like the stitching, weaving, threading through. And they contain 196 aphorisms or observations of truth. And they like to say that like threaded together, right? Like each of these aphorisms or observations of truth alone can be looked at individually. That can be a practice, each one on its own, but threaded through together, kind of like beads on a string, sort of form this comprehensive approach to living what they like to say, like this elevated life, or this path towards samadhi, or this path towards transcendence. All right. Now, while each of these statements contains sort of this wisdom on its own, right? Like I said, they like to take them together. It's like a roadmap for the student, understanding reality and approach to liberation. All right. Now, and I just apologize because my dog is barking over here. I hope you don't hear it. The Yoga Sutras are organized into 4 different chapters and they're called padas. Okay. And it's believed that Patanjali wrote the 4 chapters for 4 different students. They're individualized lesson plans according to their orientation and the experience of that student at that time. And each chapter has its unique sort of flavor. So these are the 4. Samadhi Pada, that's chapter 1. And that talks about sort of the culmination of it, and the summary of it is really union. And then sadhana pada, right? Sadhana, we already discussed on Sunday in our practice, means practice, right? Or that repetitiveness, right? And vibhuti pada, chapter 3, powers or manifestation. And then kaivalya pada is chapter 4, liberation, which we won't get too much into. So you'll see 3 different videos on this. I'll have one on Samadhi Pada, union. A second video after this will be a little bit more focused on sadhana. And then Vibhuti and Kaivalya Pada will be sort of together, because Kaivalya Pada will be very, very short, and you'll see why. Okay. So Patanjali sets the tone for all other aspects of yoga. In this first chapter, okay? He takes a systematic approach and he starts with this clear definition of the concept of yoga and explains the method for getting there, how to recognize the signs of progress, and then some of the pitfalls, right? He tells us straight away that identifying with the fluctuations of the mind, the external world, our moods, our thoughts, other people, our experiences, right? That's the external world. This leads to a state of ignorance where our vision is clouded, causing us to act from this misguided identity, and therefore we suffer, right? And you might hear in yoga someone say dukkha. Dukkha means suffering, to suffer. As identity shifts from a changing environment towards a more stable awareness, internal awareness of who we truly are, we recognize our true nature, and then we start to have insights, right? This is sort of the teaching of Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, right? Really that the world is an illusion, our identity is an illusion, and we need to sort of chip away at that, sort of get that away, turn more internal so that we can recognize our true self, who is our true nature. right? And a lot of times they like to talk about it as self with a capital S and the lowercase s for self, right? There's two selves. The little one, lowercase self, they usually talk about as our ego, that illusionary identity that we think we are, but we're not. That's not our true self. So in the first 4 sutras, Patanjali calls his students to attention and defines yoga as stilling the movements of the mind. And then he introduces a distinction between the seer and the mind. So he has this sort of dualist approach to the seer, someone seeing themselves almost like outside their body, seeing themselves be this person, and then the actual mind. And it's more like the seer is your divine self, your true nature, and the mind is prakriti, right? And we'll get to that, but prakriti is the materiality of this world. So again, philosophy is sometimes hard to understand. So again, just allow this to be your first wash, and you're going to hear things and you're going to retain some of it, but you're not going to retain all of it, right? And we'll go over it again in our live session, okay? So like it says here, in the first 4 sutras, Patanjali calls student to attention. He defines yoga as stilling the movements of the mind, right? And then he introduces a distinction between the seer and the mind. Yoga, union. So these are sort of like some words that you might want definitions of because they're Sanskrit, or you want definitions because you want to understand what he's talking about. Like I said, the seer, capital S self. So yoga, union, we talked about that our live session on Sunday. Chitta means mind or field of consciousness, okay? Vritti, I think we talked about this before, but vritti means whirlings, fluctuations, movement, okay? And then nirodha, cessation, stopping. Seer self, this is the distinction between the witness, right? This true nature self who's witnessing these things happen versus what is experienced, right? That materiality of the person who's experienced it in the world. All right. And you'll see these words are important because it's the second sutra, right? It's basically the second sutra. So I'm going to go through these different sutras a little bit more in detail. Again, I have this up here for like sort of like a summary line of what that really is about. And then I'll go a little bit deeper, right? And you don't have to take notes unless you want to. Again, this is a first wash. Just sort of bask in it, soak in it, hear what you hear. So Sutra 1.1 basically states now is the time for yoga, right? The Yoga Sutras were intended to be chanted by students to remember and teach the path to the ultimate release of suffering, right? And the ultimate suffering, they say, right, is getting out of this world. The world sucks, turn away from it. We need transcendence, get out, right? Or attain the state of enlightenment, which is the same thing, right? Reciting the sutras was part of their practice, right? Learning it, to speak it, to remember it, right? And then the first sutra is also a calling together, a starting anew, a clearing of the slate to practice with faith that the teachings will help us release pain and suffering. And then the asana posture part of the practice is one of the 8 limbs of yoga practiced in the sutras, right? And in modern times, the connection to the body is often the start of a practice. And then by making it consistent effort to be present and undertake that discipline of study, we begin to clear a pathway for peace. All right, so now is the time for yoga. And in our modern time, sometimes that is the physical asana. Sometimes, most of the time, I would say a majority of the students that actually come to a yoga class, they come because of the physical practice to start. Okay, and then Sutra 1.2, Yoga Chittas Vrittis Nirodha. This is probably the most famous of the sutras that you'll hear people say. But it basically says Yoga is the ability to stop the whirlings of the mind, right? Remember, vritti refers to spinning, whirlings, fluctuating, right? So think about, we haven't gone to the asanas yet, but pavritta, trikonasana. Trikonasana is triangle pose. Pavritta, vritti means twisting, whirling. So it's the twisting triangle, right? So the mind itself is not the problem, he says. We need a functional mind to navigate living in a body, right? So what he says is it's the incessant activity of the mind and then our identification with that activity that becomes the obstacle of our growth, okay? So this is what he's saying, yogas chittas vrittis nirodha, right? We went over yoga, union, chittas, right? Is that stopping? Sorry, the chittas is the mind, and then vritti is the whirlings, and nirodha, stopping. So we want to stop the whirlings of the mind, okay? Yoga Sutra 1.3, right? I just put here a continuation of what happens after the mind settles down. So he starts to talk about, right? And this is a path, right? He wants you to start from Sutra 1.1 and go through each one linearly. And you're supposed to do this with a guru or a teacher. You're not supposed to do this by yourself, you know, back in India when they had this, right? Nowadays, probably not. If you want to do it by yourself, you can, right? If you have questions, maybe there's somebody who knows the sutras a little bit better that can help you, right? But this path is supposed to be linear. You're supposed to really get through one before you can advance to the next, right? So this is 1.3, a continuation of what happens after the mind settles down. So you're able to sort of stop the whirlings of the mind a little bit, right? Get rid of that monkey brain. Then we begin to see clearly, the seer versus the mind, okay? So the seer is another way of referring to ourselves as pure consciousness, the unchanging, unconditioned awareness that we have in us. Pure consciousness happens when all traces of ignorance vanish. What is experienced in your self, capital S self, as pure, eternal, and with unabound awareness. So like the wave that experiences that it is now, was, and always will be one with the ocean. Peace and bliss are our intrinsic nature. Once the mind is clear, we can see this true nature. So that's why they're saying, like, we need to clear the mind, get rid of all this stuff, of this worldly stuff that's like just monkey mind in our head. Once we can clear the mind, then we can actually see clearly. We can see who our true self is, right? And that's why there was no mention of asana, of physical practice in the sutras. It really was about meditation. And then they have like other practices that you'll see, but most of it was sitting, meditating, techniques to clear the obstacles so that you can see clearly, to get rid of that in your mind, okay? Our practice helps us clear the path towards this realization, right? And that realization of material objects and circumstances in this world aren't good or bad, they're neutral and they just are, right? And so that's something I can sort of agree with, is like, you know, we've used, you know, certain maybe religions in our culture or something like that, of who decides what's good or bad, right? And we decided collectively as a culture, as a society, of what's good and bad, right? But maybe somebody else doesn't think so. And what he's saying is we need to try to see things, circumstances, material objects in the world as not good and bad, they just are. This is what life happens, right? It's really our attitude towards them, right? Our attitude towards them that makes it appear either positive or negative, right? And I can sort of see that where, like, if your attitude is a certain way, you can make something seem like super bad and super negative, and the opposite, something so positive when it's just like some normal thing, right? But what he's saying is once the seer realizes this, right? Realizes that everything is neutral, right? The mind finds no reason to be agitated. This is what he's saying. We can clear the mind, we see clearly. Then we can see that things happening, circumstances in the world are neither good nor bad, they're neutral. Then we no longer get agitated, right? We're no longer affected by the charms and temptations of the world. And if that happens, suffering ends for us, right? So just think about the logic here. Does it make sense to you? Does it not? Where can you leverage it? Where does it not work, right? And then 1.4 tells us what happens when we do not calm the fluctuations of the mind, right? And when we do that, he says that we're really clinging to our ego. If we can't calm the fluctuations, we're clinging to our ego, which is the small s self, okay? When we are not, if we're not able to still the mind does some crazy things. We form a habit of clinging to separateness, right? And remember, yoga originally was to transcend, but also to realize this going to oneness, right? And so they say, like, we form, if we're stuck in our ego and we focus clinging to the ego, that we form this habit of clinging to separateness from differentiation samkhya, okay? And the ego identifying with mental activity, the things happening in our head, or the stories, right? Because they're just stories. All of our lives are stories, right? Some of them made up, some of them real, but they're stories. And he's saying that we get caught up, we get clinging to the stories, the ego of our life. And then the world of our mental activity becomes captivating. This drama becomes so real that we lose ourselves in the theatrics of it, and then we forget who we are, right? And forget we are only witnesses to this playing in our head, right? So he really wants to see us as the seer, the person who is actually watching and seeing rather than experiencing in life, because we're trying to get to transcendence, liberation, okay? And there are many examples of this in the external world now, but the simplest is the identification of all the roles we play in daily life, right? So manager, mother, sister, husband, coach, caretaker, fat, skinny, etc. These roles may change frequently in our mind, but they do not change our true nature, our inner self, capital S, inner self. All right. So again, if this is confusing, whatever, it's okay. Just get this first wash. Really, I want to give you the Yoga Sutras, because most yoga studios, I'll say this, they sort of teach the Yoga Sutras as this is it. This is what yoga philosophy is. And I want to teach it to you so you have an understanding, maybe can have an educated conversation with somebody about it, or with other yoga teachers perhaps. Or there are some things in here that you can glean, right? You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There's some things that you can take from it, and then some of the things you leave it, right? Take what works for you, leave the rest. All right. So Patanjali describes the mental modifications, and so what can we do to our minds, right? Modifications, and explains how the complementary practice of these three things, abhyasa, which is practice or willful effort, or vairagya, vairagya, surrender, non-attachment, right? Retrain the modifications, moving the mind towards stability, right? And effort, non-attachment, and then various stages of samadhi, right, which is defined as absorption, right? Absorption in realizing that we're one with the universe, we're one with everything, we're never not hitched. Patanjali outlines very clearly which attitudes to cultivate in our minds and hearts in yoga and daily living, in our friendships, in our communities and our families, right? In his sutras, he tells you which attitudes to have, right, for our mind and our heart. He establishes that samadhi, right, which is a state of union, total absorption, is possible and is reached more quickly with ardent practice and devotion. So this was the first chapter, right, of the Yoga Sutras, Samadhi Pada. All right. And I just bring up these three words because you might hear them, right? Think about abhyasa, willful effort. Think about, for me, it's thinking about your yoga practice. It's willful effort because you decide to show up. You decide to do that class, right? Surrender, right? What is it in your yoga practice, right? Always bring it back to the yoga practice to maybe come up with some ideas of where this might work, where it might not, right? Surrender. What is it that you might need to surrender to in your yoga practice, right? Maybe surrendering that, maybe learning about anatomy and the anatomy of my own body makes me realize that, I always wanted to do handstand, but because of the structure of my body, maybe that's not possible, right? And then samadhi, absorption, complete absorption, getting into that transcendence view. Is that possible? Is that possible for someone in the modern day? Is that possible for me, for my life? Right? So that's chapter 1, and we'll move on to chapter 2.